Okay, so let's start. Warmly welcome to Henry Hank Greenspan's honorary doctoral lecture, What Remains, Moments from a Life Among Holocaust Survivors. My name is Malin Thor Tureby, and I'm the head of research at the Department of Society, Identity and Culture. And it's therefore my honor to moderate this lecture by Hank. I will begin with a brief introduction and then hand over the floor, and Hank will speak for approximately 35 to 40 minutes, and after which we will have plenty of time for questions and discussions. For those of you who is joining us online, you won't be able to speak directly, but you are more than welcome to email me your comments or questions during the talk, and I will read them aloud to Hank. It is both a profound honor and personal joy to introduce Henry Hank Greenspan, a scholar whose work has deeply influenced my own thinking and practice as an oral historian and as a Holocaust scholar. It is difficult to overstate the impact Hank Greenspan has had on the fields of oral history and Holocaust studies. His approach to engaging with Holocaust survivors has not only reshaped our understanding of testimony and interview practices, but had also offered a deeply ethical model for how we listen, how we relate, and how we co-create knowledge, how we learn together. Unlike conventional methods that rely on single interviews, often conducted by strangers, Hank's work is grounded in long-term relationships. He met with survivors not just once, but repeatedly over months, years, and in some cases, decades. His conversations are not designed to produce a fixed or final account. Rather, they allow insights and perspectives to evolve over time, shaped by sustained dialogues and collaborative interpretations. This approach carries ethical implications that extend far beyond methodology. It challenges us to consider what it truly means to listen and to hear another person. As the philosopher Martin Buber wrote, all real living is meeting. Hank's work embodies this principle. His conversations are not transactions, they are encounters. He does not treat survivors as subjects to be documented, but as partners in dialogue. He listens not to extract, but to understand. In this way, Hank Greenspan has given us more than a method. He has offered a model of care and ethical engagement. He has shown us that the most meaningful work occurs not in the moment of recording, but in the long arc of relationships and conversations. Henry Hank Greenspan is being awarded an honorary doctorate by the Faculty of Education and Society at Malmo University in recognition of more than 50 years of sustained conversations with Holocaust survivors. His work continues to inspire and challenge us to think more deeply, listen more carefully, and engage more ethically. I now have the honor of handing over the floor or the Zoom link to Hank. You are so very welcome to Malmo University.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, good friend Malin, and thanks to all who are tuning in this morning. It's here this morning. I wish I could be there personally, but I can't, but I can be here at least in this form, be there in this form. I want to give a special thanks, really return what Malin said about me. It's the same essential thing. There are very few people, not only in our field, but in my experience in academia in general, if I can say that, who combine the brilliance, the kindness, the generosity, and the consistency of integrity that Malin does. We agreed we could all use first names, so I am, and she is a unique person, and it is my privilege to be her colleague and her friend over these years. And really, that's part of the joy of being able to share whatever I can. She also did me the great favor of summarizing much of what I would have said at the beginning. So it's done, which is great because we'll have more time to talk. I won't have to repeat any of that. But I will say just one thing about this method that she mentioned of meeting with people more than once. Um, that actually came from survivors, at least initially. People said after a first interview, I didn't know. I was a grad student. I wasn't sure where it was all going, to be honest. We're kind of making it up. I was in my 20s at that time. Seems like a long time ago. I had hair, etc. And they said, come back next week. We'll talk some more. I said, we will. I was a grad student. What did I know? So I did. And one week led to another week to another week. And as Malin summarized, in some cases, that meant a period of a few months of meeting, some years, some decades, with few people. So yes, full relationships. And it was, of course, not like every time we got together, we spoke about the war and what happened then. We spoke about everything, especially those people whom I knew over years or even decades. Everything. And it wasn't getting together in a formal setting. There's advantages to that. You can interview a lot of people, right? If you interview them once in a studio in relatively controlled circumstances. For me, it was meeting, yes, in a living room, sometimes with an audio recorder. I didn't use video, and I still wouldn't. Too intrusive for me. But we would meet in cars. I mean, on the way, I would be with survivors on their way to talks in other places. I wasn't their, chaperone, but I was their friend. So we would go along. So some conversations were more formal, some were over lunch, some were in cars, some were on trips, some were weddings, bar mitzvahs, you name it. And everything was part of the conversation. And so remembrances of the war and implications were all in that context of full relationship. I mentioned two things that emerge from that that may not be as obvious that I should say. Obviously, what is obvious is that it inspires a certain trust, a certain candor when you know someone well and you're part of an ongoing conversation, not a, if I can say it this way, a blind date interview. Yeah. Um, but among other things, it gave me the opportunity to listen to interviews, and I used to get audio between sessions. So, anyone who's listened to their own interviews knows it's a very humbling experience. Oh, you hear all the stuff that you wish you'd asked, all the stuff that you're sorry you didn't, and the things above all that you want to get further clarity on. So one of the practices I developed after a while was to bring segments of earlier interviews to later ones so that the survivors and I could listen together, not long pieces, but a few minutes. And I have to say the survivors love that. This is collaboration on the ground. Collaboration is one of those terms that we all use these days, but this is very specific. And so we would listen together to those excerpts from prior interviews, and new stuff would arise. Survivors said, yes. Oh, yeah, that was it. No, I didn't tell you that. And then the other thing, but no, that you're right, that wasn't clear, etc. A survivor from whom you will hear a lot today, even in these few minutes, named Augie Ruman, who was a very close friend, kind of like my mother, who became, I realized we weren't as different in age as that, so more like an aunt or an older sister. But Augie once said about these kinds of interviews, one thought sparks another, and then another that I didn't even know I had. That's the part that's so gratifying. Whatever I think I'm teaching, I'm learning at the same moment. We're learning together. We're learning together. Now, that's my way of summarizing not only a good interview, but really what I try to do in life. And all of you, and all of us who are teachers do the same thing, right? It's not only dispensing information, in my view, if it's a good class, it's learning together, certainly in a seminar. We've all probably experienced, or a good conversation of any kind, that exhilaration when people don't just tell people stories or tell people data, but in the process of conversing, in the process of listening, in the process of building on each other's ideas, you come to new stuff, right? That was in nobody's head going in, nobody's head. So what matters, kind of like Buber, is what happens between people. Yes, what it matters what's in each person's head, but it's between those heads that the really interesting and indeed even exhilarating moments happen. Yeah, even about tough things, and maybe especially about tough things, right? To be able to suddenly get a new insight, a new realization about such experiences can be indeed an almost ecstatic experience, even about very difficult things. So that's what I aspire to facilitate. The other thing that follows from knowing people well is that the range of what we discussed got very wide. And I don't just mean all of life, as you'll hear, which not all, but so much came in. But even about this particular topic, most interviews, and including mine, began with some version of a chronology of what happened as people recalled it, what they witnessed, what they experienced during the war. But that was only the beginning. The archived interview, the testimony, very important. I'm glad we do that. That's usually the end. There may be a few minutes about life before, a few minutes about life after, but mainly it's focused on specifically what happened or what someone witnessed during the war. In my quote interviews, really conversations as they developed, it started that way. But for example, questions arose, some that are very close to me and that I've been thinking about from the beginning, 50 years ago. Can it be retold at all? Those kinds of questions. Can others understand in your experience to that survivor? How do you choose what to tell, how to tell, when to tell, with whom, where, under what circumstances? Survivors make those choices. And it's incredibly, I have learned, informing to hear their take on how they do that, how they make those choices. And if I can say, and I don't want to go after my colleagues too much, but I will a little, the typical pattern is you watch or you listen to the tape as though it were some sort of raw data, unmediated, as though the survivor weren't making choices. And then you, as expert back in the study, say, well, the reason they said this there is because of trauma, or the reason they said this there is because whatever, guilt, who knows? It's all speculation. And of course, it will remain speculation, but to have the survivor's own take on why they said what, where, and did not say something else somewhere else with someone else is incredibly informing and sadly, in my view, and a dimension that we've much ignored. So that was part of these discussions. Another part was the psychological impact. Again, we have a zillion theories about the psychology of survivors. You'll hear a survivor comment on that in a moment. But we also talked about that from their perspective, right? What did they see as the impact on them personally of having lived through and after such destruction? What was their psychology of all of those experiences? How about the impact of the Holocaust on the world? Has it had any? From their perspective, it's a real question. And these are questions that come up typically, say, in a car ride back from a talk. These are not questions usually that are part of a formal testimony, because by definition, if you're sitting there doing that, you probably think it's important, and it is important, obviously. But there are questions, and given the world as it is, and as sad to say it's going, it's not obvious. And some survivors were very clear that no, when they were, quote, young and naive, as one man said, they thought it would change the world, that maybe this madness would be resolved. Clearly, it hasn't happened, he said. Clearly, it hasn't happened. So, there's a degree of candor and reflection that typically doesn't happen in formally recorded interviews. My students' favorite question, and many of yours, how about faith in humanity, in divinity? How was that impacted by going through these experiences? That's something that survivors and I spoke a lot about. So you're hearing this is oral history, but it's equally oral psychology, oral theology, oral narratology, meaning all of those questions speaking or not speaking and how. What about death? What about getting up in the morning? What about having children? What about what remains of the world that was? What about anticipating your own death? Hmm? Which you'll hear something about also today. It's another topic which, for perhaps very good reasons, we tend not to ask survivors about. we tend to wish, they're survivors after all, that they would be somehow immortal. Well, wonderful or not as they may be, they are people like us. They are not immortal, nor are we. So that's something, and I suppose, especially as I myself have realized my own mortality increasingly and gotten older, and like all of us gone through the pandemic, and like all of us gone through some of the madness of the current world in a variety of ways, we think about endings perhaps differently. And so I did with the survivor. So all of this adds up to the fact that I had incredible privilege to be able to talk with these folks over that length of time about issues that really mattered to me and really mattered to them, kind of by definition, right? Now, and I don't want to suggest that every survivor wants to do that with Hank, right? No. It's a select group. But you know what? Even in the big archives, it's a select group. The majority of survivors never spoke to anybody except perhaps each other. And it doesn't matter how big the archive is, it's always a select group, right? Some groups perhaps more selective than others. Chemistry always has something to do with, quote, oral history. Not everybody's the best interview with everybody else. You can't get around that, nor should we. What we should do, given the fact that we know it's selective, is pool our knowledge together on a sort of collective level, learn together from the different ways we understand what we've been hearing, etc., over the years. So we have to learn together as scholars, researchers, whatever, however we think of ourselves, as much as we hope to learn together with our students, learn together with the folks whom we get to know, in my case, Holocaust survivors. Finally, you'll hear references on occasion to Remnants. Remnants is a play. I didn't start out wanting to be a playwright, but it kind of happened that way, sort of a playwright. The bottom line, the foundation of everything that I've been trying to do are these, I call them interviews, call them extended conversations over time. But after about 15 years, there were so many moments that I found were mind-blowing. Things that people said, not only that they said or what they said, but how they said it. How they said it, the image that they sort of hit on that just kind of nailed it. That I just wanted to preserve it in some way. And I have a little acting, whatever, inclination in me, more than I realized. And so in the late 80s, I began to put together a piece called Remnants, which you'll hear reference to. That's why I'm mentioning it, which is a trajectory of monologues based on, it's not verbatim, but based on what people told me. The images, the experiences are exactly what they said. That I wanted to preserve in that way and, again, share. And whenever I do that play, there's always, and I started to do it in 97, I started to do it as a solo show. The play goes about 45 minutes. The discussion goes at least 45 minutes after. And that's, like today, is really the place to get. So I'm going to hold this up. I'm not selling a book, but it has the script of Remnants, and it also has a complementary literary memoir called What Remains. And today, I'll be drawing on excerpts from What Remains, right? Which is looking back a little bit on the process of remnants and the survivors I got to know through that, but more broadly, my wider relationships with survivors, many of whom are not represented in that play, um, but of which the play is one expression, one attempt to sort of condense things. And, as people in theater know, what you try to do not only is tell, but show. So that was the opportunity to use my voice, my body, to show some of what I was hearing, not only describe it from the outside. Yeah. And I have found over the years that, every genre has its claim and its advantages and disadvantages. That has turned out, for me at least, to be one particularly effective way of conveying, quote, information, really sharing folks. So in that spirit, I want to share some of my friends, and I will be drawing from What Remains, which is the second part of this book. just out. First section is called Gone, and you'll meet again, Agi, to begin with. Most of the survivors whom I first met 50 years ago are gone. I'm not sure why I say gone, as though they've only left, as though they might be back. Sometimes I say they're no longer on the planet, as though they were on some other planet. It's been hard to let them go. Beyond my family, being with survivors, talking with survivors, thinking and writing about my talking with survivors, has been the center of my life. Agi Rubin was the center, the heart of all of these years. For 8 months in 1980, we met every Monday for an interview that became a conversation, that became a friendship, that became a co-authored book. We met over coffee, cigarettes, and lunch in various order. Agi was Hungarian, and she cooked like one, meaning it was fantastic. Paprikash, paprikash, paprikash. Yes, paprika. As you heard, over years of conversation, Agi and I didn't only talk about the war, not even close, we spoke about everything. Indeed, I shared, or Agi met, all my girlfriends from those years early on, and for some reason she remembered one woman as a Diane. Now, as far as I recall, I never went out with a Diane. Maybe I should have. Maybe somewhere there's a Diane Paprikash, perhaps in Sweden. I don't know. Seders, the Passover meal at Agi, were unique. The guests call themselves the Hungarian mafia. Doctors, lawyers, dressmakers, shopkeepers, no gangsters as far as I know. They welcome me even though I'm part Galicianer, Jewish from southern Poland, part Viennese, and maybe a little Lithuanian, what we call Litvak in the tribe. They'd asked me where I was from, where my family was from. Nevertheless, as is Passover tradition, they welcomed the stranger. Agi was very pleased with, I'd say proud of, my reconstruction of her memories in Remnants. The vanity, which is the last monologue, is the anchor of the play, her story, and she came to many performances, both before and after I began doing it solo. In one of the befores was a production by a well-known Jewish theater in our area, very professional theater, and like many professional theaters doing Holocaust-themed pieces, they went way over the top, right? Intensely, over-dramatized. If there's any topic that doesn't need over the top, it's the Holocaust. Yeah? Less is almost always more. And after the performance, Agi sidled up to me and she whispered, "Never let them do it again." Then she took a step back and winked and said, "Never again." You have to be in the mafia to say stuff like that. In later years, when I heard Agi recount the experience that the vanity, that monologue recalls, I realized that she retold it increasingly like the version that's reconstructed in the play. I don't mean verbatim, but closer to its pacing, connections, and conclusions. In essence, she was borrowing back my retelling of what I initially borrowed from her. Whoever was retelling it, the vanity had developed between us. Yeah, again, between, learning together. Now, I confess I felt giddy and guilty when I noticed this. Born in New York after the war by a few years, I'd influenced the survivor testimony? I mean, it didn't seem right. In effect, I had co-written some of it. But then I realized that many of the stories we tell, especially the most important, are co-written in one way or another. They also develop between us. For example, we share a memory with a friend, someone who knows us well, and they may suggest a metaphor, a theme, a connection that really nails it or helps nail it for us, that really makes sense of what we have to retell. And the next time we tell that story, we may well borrow our friend's image connection theme. And we won't give them a footnote, right? Why should we? We do that all the time. Footnotes aren't needed. All that's needed is good friends, good conversation. Good conversation is for me the goal of everything, whether with survivors, students, people in general. Good conversation of this kind about important things will not solve the world, unfortunately. But it is hard to imagine anything that could without it. In 2016, I received a voicemail from Augie. She was in the hospital, and she said she needed my help. She said there was one more chapter that we needed to write. It would not be about all the people, it would be about all the people who had helped her through her life. It would be a chapter of gratitude. The book that Augie and I co-authored had been published 10 years earlier. Of course, I knew there was no way we could add a new chapter to that. But logic in such instances is beside the point, of course. The next day I went to the hospital. Augie was dying of emphysema, barely able to breathe. She recognized me, but not much more. She didn't mention the chapter that she'd imagined the day before. So this memory must itself represent a part of that chapter, of that gratitude, which I return. From these 50 years of life among survivors, Augie and others whom you meet, gratitude is a large part of what remains. Now another survivor to introduce you to, a very memorable person, as you will see, and also a friend, not only of mine and many, but a friend of Augie's. They were often together. Even though he was a bit of a, not an Auslander, not a foreigner, he was from Romania. But in those days, Transylvania depended on who won the last war. Augie's hometown could be in Hungary, it's now in Ukraine, it could be in Czechoslovakia, in Slovakia. Boundaries, as you all know, moved around and still do, for good and ill. In our first interview in 1980, Abe asked me, "So, Hank, you're a psychologist?" "Yeah," I answered. I'm in training. "Training, okay. So, as a psychologist still in training, you think we're crazy? You think the survivors are all crazy?" I tread water. Abe rescues me. "Of course we're crazy. You'd have to be crazy to go through something like that and not be crazy." I love telling Abe stories. You could go on forever. He was a hot dog. His stories from childhood, well before the war, were mostly about standing up to big shots and how he likes to Eures reden. You know Yiddish? You don't know Yiddish. Eures reden, to speak out, Eures reden. I'm not shy. Ask my wife. I'm not shy. I didn't have to ask his wife. Abe especially enjoyed visiting university classes, not just mine. "I was a little Jewish kid in Romania. Now you professors," big shots, right? "Invite me to the big University of Michigan, so maybe I'm not such a little kid anymore." In a Holocaust history class, not mine, a student got up and asked the most obsessively qualified question I'd ever heard. I was wondering, do you think that the Roosevelt administration possibly, well, maybe they could have done more? If they had wanted to do it. This went on for a while. Abe waves his hand to shut him up and really to put him and the rest of us out of misery. And then he looked at all of us and said in this way, "I can answer your question in 3 words. We got screwed." As usual, he brought down the house. No one read an audience better than Abe. Now, it does get complicated. When Abe exclaimed, "Of course we're crazy," he wasn't only doing shtick comedy with me, although he partly was. He partly was. But he also told me about days in later discussions when his, quote, inner Nazis, as he called them, got the upper hand. His business, his family, the life he created after the war, he was in a panic about losing all of it. Losing all of it. Now, there was no obvious danger at those times. In that sense, he was, quote, out of touch with reality. But he was certainly not out of touch in general. Losing everything is precisely what happened to him as to so many others. It would be truly crazy not to imagine it happening again. And in our own day, even less crazy not to imagine it happening again to many as it has happened to many in our own time. So this is not essentially about memory. It's about knowledge. For him and other survivors, in the bones knowledge. So it's complicated, and we should allow it to be complicated. Not say it's this, not say it's that. Let it be as complicated as it is. Not try to find a higher synthesis where there is none. Not dumb it down. As usual, Agi put it together as well as anyone I ever heard. She said, "We survivors are bundles of contradictions. When we're here, we're also there. And even the past is split in two: memories of home, which we usually try to recapture, and memories of the destruction of home, which we usually try to forget. So there are many strands at once. It is not that our joys are not real." I want to underline that one. It is not that our joys are not real. They are entirely real. It's just that they never exist simply by themselves. They're always in reference to something else, something that can consume them in an instant. And then there are simply the blank spaces, the spaces where things were and people were that are not anymore. Even when home and life are recreated, the losses are never made whole. I'm going to turn to the issue of loss now. As I said, has been central in my own thinking for many reasons, in recent years especially. Now, obviously, with a title like What Remains, that's what you would expect. I knew a survivor named Reuben, who owned a small electric parts store in what we used to call inner city Detroit. That's a euphemism for Black Detroit. He tells me that he could have moved out after the 1967 Detroit riots or rebellion, but he stayed. I could have moved out years back, but sometimes I just feel, I don't know. It reminds me sometimes like the buildings, all boarded up. Sometimes it reminds me like the ghetto from the riots in the city. They never did anything to it after that. Everything was boarded up and ruined. It was a lot like in the ghetto in Lodz in Poland. After 1967, only a few customers came, and Reuben spent most of each day alone in his store, dreaming back, as he said, to pre-war Jewish Lodz. He even imagined writing a novel, not about the Holocaust, but about the whole life, the whole life, the whole life, the whole life before the Holocaust, with the Holocaust included. Reuben never wrote the novel. I think he lived it, finding a ghetto that reminded him of that ghetto, choosing not to leave. Unpublished and unpublic, it was a kind of dream. Agi had an actual dream in Auschwitz-Birkenau itself while she was there. Every night, she dreamed that she was a child cradled in her mother's lap. Quote, "But the fence, the barbed wire is there, and it always ends with that. The good sheltered feeling is very temporary. It's very minor. That's how far you could go, even in a dream." Years and years later, I was with Augie when the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum opened in 1993. It was a cold, wet, brutally windy day. And Augie recalled, for years, I saw my mother floating in the air, in the smoke, in the wind, and I couldn't reach her. I couldn't bring her down. We want to feel that our dead are somewhere. What happened to them is somewhere, and not simply erased. We want to believe that the museum is a place to remember, even a grave, even a cemetery. But I must tell you, this is improvisation. This is pretending. And we know it. We want to believe it, even as we are reminded that it is cold and it is raining and the wind still blows. We can improvise. We can borrow a ghetto in Detroit to stand in for the obliterated ghetto of Lodz. We can borrow a museum to stand in for cemeteries that exist nowhere. But there are limits. That's how far you can go, even in a dream. Augie's mother improvised during the first moments of their arrival in Auschwitz. Augie was sent to one side, her mother and little brother to the other, and she ran over to be with them, after all, her family. But the SS shoved her, even pushed her to the ground. Effectively, we'll kill you when we want to. Her mother saw this happening, even as her own line was being led away to the gas. Over the din, she called out, "Go, my child, go. We will see each other tomorrow." And Augie says, and I've been going ever since then. As we lose survivors, as they are gone, Holocaust museums, education centers, and similar programs become increasingly forward-looking. The rhetoric is about future generations, teaching resilience, transmitting the legacy. Many institutions, including the one near me in Michigan, have dropped the word memorial entirely. The former Holocaust Memorial Center is now simply the Holocaust Center. Other centers have done the same, including one in Montreal. Meanwhile, as survivors approach their deaths, they move in the opposite direction. I've been with a number of survivors at or near the end of their lives. In general, they speak about those who will follow, the future generations, with hope and with love. But dying survivors return to their foundations, to the past, in which they were most unambiguously cherished, that whole world that has been erased. In imagination, memory, and dream, they construct their own memorial centers, and they speak to us from there. So once again, Augie, one last time today. What is that word they always use? That word, legacy, legacy, legacy. What is my legacy? We who are there know how limited can be any parent's ability to prepare the younger generation for what can happen. We know that very well. But then I think of my own parents, the legacy that I myself received, and I realized it's made up of small things that turned out to be precious to me. Things I gathered up as much because I needed them as because my parents wanted me to have them. I barely remember my mother's face, but I remember her principles somehow. certain ways one tries to live one's life. My father, who survived the war, was with me through much more of my life. It was a full, mature relationship. And yet, when I think of him, I just remember certain moments. I remember the way he sang Ein Kadahinu, one of our Jewish prayers. And whenever I'm at the synagogue, I hear his voice. At certain prayers or hymns, I remember how much joy he got out of singing that particular one. And when it comes up, he is again with me, and I'm singing with him. It is the harmony of voices that makes the legacy. The way I tune myself to him and feel his spirit singing through my own voice. Even now, we are singing together. So actually, what is a legacy? It's these small things that are taken up by those who follow. I can provide whatever I can provide, but in the end, my legacy is not up to me. It's up to whoever comes after to pick up this bit, remember that part, find harmony with whatever note as it may apply to their own circumstances, which I know will be different from mine. You'll take what you choose, what you need, just as I did. I can only wish you well and wish you peace. So one last time, I remember my mother's voice, and I repeat what she said to me as she looked across the mud and agony, trying to get my attention, trying to imagine a future, trying to invoke hope, trying to bestow the only blessing that in the end this world allows. Go, my child, go. Go, my beloved children and grandchildren. Go, my dear comrades and friends. Go, my kind listeners. Go. Thank you. So now, I hope, we'll have time for some good conversation. Yeah, some learning
Yeah,
together.
let's start a conversation. Thank you so much, Hank, for your lecture and for your talk. Does anyone in the audience want to start with a question or a comment?
Hello, my name is Barbara Posner. I'm the daughter of two survivors of the Holocaust. And I'm wondering if you think that the persons, the survivors that you interviewed, did they maybe tell you things that they didn't tell their own children? And if the answer is yes, what is your explanation to that? Thank you.
The answer is yes. And they told me the reason. This changed over the years, but early on, it was not unusual for their children, and I'm that age, right, born after the war by a few years, often stationed themselves outside the room where we were meeting. The survivor knew that the kids were there, but they found it easier to talk with me as a not family member, as not their child, at that time at least, than the child. And what they said is that, you're not going to be here tomorrow morning for breakfast. I'm not going to have to worry that there's something I said that will trouble you, that you'll worry about, etc. So it's easier for me to talk with you as a quote outsider to the family. I think that changed in many cases over the years, but in those years, yes, that's what the survivors I knew said.
Somebody else have a question?
Otherwise, I have a question.
Good.
You have spent your life working with survivors, and you have focused a lot on the process of survivors retelling. But you have also written a lot about us, the listeners, the audience. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Half of Remnants, that play I mentioned, as you know, Malin, is about us. I have been very interested in us, and to be honest, I haven't been very kind over the years in my writing about us. And that's, look, we, the us, are a very diverse group, and I would not claim, and would not obviously, to be somehow, in a different category. I think I've softened in this way, meaning, and survivors are frankly more generous than I am about us. The big picture is that early on, in most instances, certainly US, in Israel, as I have learned as well, and in other countries, survivors were mostly not listened to. In some cases, quite actively silenced. And the general gist of that was, it's time to move on. Many of the survivors whom I knew in the US remembered the lyric, when you laugh, the whole world laughs with you. When you cry alone. The next thing they would say, and that's exactly what we did. Or another, the guy, the Oyosreden, Abe, said, my cousin from the dentist in California said, Abe, I know exactly what you went through. I saw the newsreels. I don't want to hear a word about it. Yeah? So the presumption that we know, that's probably the most central thing. In my perhaps less generous view than I should have, there's a heck of a lot that we assume and have assumed about survivors over the years. A lot of which is not based on much reality. It's kind of fantasy. Well, they must have gone through this. They must feel that. They must be this. In the beginning, again, it was sort of damaged goods. There was a lot of pity. There was a lot of poor baby. There was a lot of psychiatrists. This is ironic. Psychiatrists at a conference on trauma organized by survivors themselves, who were psychiatrists. A psychiatrist who was there, who was not a survivor, said, all these people walk around like human wrecks and ghosts. Now, human wrecks and ghosts, as far as I know, don't create important academic conferences. Not usually. But this was the assumption. And then the rhetoric, it sort of flipped. I mean, there was still that, what I call psychiatric dialogue in the background. And that would flip, and we all know it. Trauma, 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 survivor, guilt, 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 guilt. That's one strand. And on the top, there's this, suddenly survivors became celebrities of sorts, heroes of resilience and triumph of the human spirit. And look, all of this is part of the truth. What's a challenge is to understand the range and the complexity, as Augie pointed out. Yeah. And many survivors whom I know, know that. And some would say, every year I get a call from the rabbi or somebody, they want me to talk, but I'm not going to do it because they want me to tell them something inspiring. And most of what I have to say is not inspiring, not because it's all negative, but it's not the rhetoric that they expect. So yes, it's been a struggle. One could go on, I could go on. But certainly in Israel, I mean, there's been a sophistication to some extent, strangely, in my mind. As we are now, as everyone says, losing survivors, suddenly it's like we can't let go. So we created, some of you will know, most of us call them holograms, that people who do it call interactive biography. So we have these bots, these, I don't know, some kind of artificial intelligence that I don't understand, but they're sort of programmed to be there in a kind of phantasm way and answer questions and what have you. So it's kind of like we want to keep them alive, even though they're not. So it's been multifaceted. It's been complicated. Survivors are more compassionate than I am about this, in the sense that, look, I realize it is hard to get. And what happens, this is the bottom line. And we do this with other people whose experience scares us. People, cancer patients, people who have neurodegenerative disease, things that, we kind of don't know quite how to handle. And so we either do nothing or we find ways to keep distance. And survivors have often said, look, I don't understand it. Even when I was there, even when I was in Auschwitz, how could that be real? How could that, I don't get it. Even when I was there, I didn't understand. Even when I was there, I didn't believe it. So they're more generous than I am in terms of understanding why others struggle. Sorry, last point. I have some friends, good friends and colleagues, who say to me, Hank, I would like to, but I don't want to go to your play because I can't deal. I mean, I don't want to deal with that stuff. I don't want to go see that movie, that film, because it's too painful for me. I bless those people, right? Because that means they get it. If they don't want to go, that means at heart, they understand that it ain't going to be easy and it should not be. What is really scary, and I've heard this too, especially from some younger people who say, I love Holocaust movies. I want to go and hear more about it. I like people who want to learn. But this is a kind of a thrill ride. That's what I'm hearing. Now that is scary. That's really scary. Okay, I'll stop.
Thank you.
Hi, Henry. Thank you very much for an excellent lecture. I'm Tobias Olsson, serve as a Dean at the Faculty of Education and Society. And I have a question for you that might take you a very long time to answer, but I ask you to give you brief comments rather.
I'll try.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting how you unpack the notion of doing interviews and conducting interviews in sort of in a very long way and getting back to the same subject once over and over and again. Could you say something about your sort of the theoretical and or methodological inspiration for your take on interviews? And as I said, I know it's challenging to be brief about it, but say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, the honest truth is, I didn't have a model. And that's quite true. I'm sure there are other people who do this, anthropologists perhaps, although I wasn't thinking much about it. And the other thing I should say, actually, I am a clinical psychologist, right? None of my interviews were any kind of therapy, but I had training in the habit of meeting with people for long periods of time and going deeper and deeper and deeper. So that, I should say, along with survivors suggesting it, I think my work as a psychologist was very informing of a kind of a way of engaging people, a way of using time, a way of waiting, a way of being patient, a way of not jumping in before it was time. It's good training and listening. So that served me well. And finally, if there's a theorist at all, my hero in life is American psychologist, philosopher William James. William James did not do interviews, but in, for example, his classic work, Varieties of Religious Experience, he used very long excerpts from people who had gone through a whole range of religious experience. James was the kind of guy who spent a lot of time listening, not literally with his ears, but with his eyes and his mind and his heart to long reflections of other people. So, and was very committed to that. So James was a big influence as well as training in psychology and the survivors.
I think we have time for one more question. Barbara.
Survivors are said generally not having wanted to tell about their experiences. And I find that's a generalization. And I also think that that is something that will to tell could change over time. I know, for example, and sometimes exterior factors can influence the survivor to tell. I know for a fact that my mother, who belonged to a group of 20 survivors who went to schools here in southern Sweden, they formed the group in the end of the 80s because of the Holocaust deniers. David Irving and on his gang. And that motivated them to go out and tell the truth. And I would like, if you could elaborate a little bit on that. How could a survivor's wish and will to tell the story maybe change over time, and what factors may have influenced him or her? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think you summed it up very well. Some of it had to do with response to deniers, which were getting more press, as they still are. In response to that, I saw that, especially in Canada, I was aware of a lot of survivors who, quote, came out of the closet for the first time in response to that. Some would say that as their kids got older, in their 20s, there was a lot of encouragement from, their young 20-year-old children to speak more. And suddenly there were all these projects like the Shaw Foundation project. There were places to do it and a lot of encouragement. So that mattered too. I think in general, there was a greater interest in the history in the US and I think around the world. That famous 1978 TV miniseries, which had its own issues, but still it like Roots did for Black history, it kind of brought out a wider pop cultural interest in the war and in what people endured. That mattered. And over the years, it continues as people age. I know some survivors who felt, often with their child's encouragement, that, okay, I've come to the end of my life or near it. Now I should do it, at least to my child. And so I know good friends of mine who are children of survivors who had an interview with one of their parents at the end, really the first time. But I think we ought not forget that it's still true that the majority of survivors have remained silent. And it's also true that many, in my experience, wanted to talk about it early on. My friend Abe, in the play Remnants, the first line of his part of it is, in the beginning, right after the war, we wanted to talk about it. I mean, if we could talk about it, we wanted to talk about it. So he was that. Again, he's an Oilersleden guy, a guy who spoke out, a guy who wanted to. Many survivors were that, many survivors were not. Augie's husband, for example, was not. And it took years before, as she put it, he, quote, came out of his shell and he was ready.
Thank you, Hank. And I don't know what happens with the link when it turns 4:30, but I have a question in my email from Jan, who says, many thanks for a very inspiring lecture and insights. With what you have learned from survivors and about survivors, what advice do you have to us, their relatives and friends who continue to tell their survivor stories when almost all of them are gone, when we meet the listeners and also new listeners?
All right. Boy, nothing I'm going to say is going to be news. And what matters, in my view, is just to learn the relevant history as well as you can. You have to be informed by that, not just your folks, but the wider context. And you have to be patient, have to take your time, and you have to recognize, in my view, you weren't there. I assume it depends on when you were born and so on. Maybe you were partly there. But in my view, the so-called second generation are not survivors, but they know things. They were there when, say, parents had nightmares, and I wasn't there. They were there. They knew more than I survivors as real people, quote, as full people. That's important. because again, we continue to put survivors, in little boxes, categories, as Augie once said. Yeah. So getting to know people, warts and all, as us, and that's the bottom line. Survivors are us, right? We weren't there, whether we were their kids or someone like me, and I'm not. We were not there, but we're all human beings. And I've said and written many times that the reason to listen to survivors is to listen to survivors. You don't have to have some wider agenda, even though, we learn so much. Still, just as it would be to listen to anyone who's gone through such hell and somehow come out the other side. Listening is an end. It's not just a means. And so for you to pass on what you know and your experience with your folks, the personal aspect, the historical aspect as you have it, but I would say, don't pretend to know more than you know. None of us, it's always limited, whatever we know, historically and otherwise. So in a calm, whatever way is natural for you, that's the bottom line. In the meantime, we have the recordings, we have the video testimonies and others, we have so many memoirs now that I think we'll be fine. I think we'll be fine.
Thank you, Hank. And I think we end the session with those wise words. Thank you so much for your lecture, Hank, and talk to you soon again.
Thank you. Best to all. Do I?